Welcome to the Wisp Mama Bear Podcast, episode 27. I'm your host, Sarah Yacoub. Today's topic, riots. On May 25th, 2020, the world, including any kid with a smartphone, watched as Minneapolis police killed 46-year-old George Floyd, an unarmed black man. This wasn't the first, and wouldn't be the last time an unarmed person of color would die in the hands of law enforcement, and yet it sparked a movement that radiated across the globe. What made George Floyd's murder different? Well, for one, it happened in the light of day, with an audience, where the officer suffocating George and the officers who stood by and watched could see that they were being filmed. For 8 minutes and 46 seconds, Officer Chauvin rested his weight through his knee into the neck of another human being, pressing George's face into a dirty street as he lost consciousness and died. During that time, members of the public repeatedly stated that George could not breathe, asking the officers to stop, to do something, to not let him die. Officer Chauvin pressed on, while the other officers surrounding him enabled in more or less silence. It was a display of entitled callousness that we typically don't see publicly, let alone from those trusted and empowered to serve and protect the community. Officer Chauvin committed the ultimate crime of murder and didn't even try to hide it. A Black Lives Matter solidarity march, organized by community leader Addison Philitrew, ended in the parking lot of the Hudson Police Department. Those in attendance took a knee for 8 minutes and 46 seconds of silence to acknowledge the gravity of what happened. The gravity of watching a member of law enforcement slowly kill a man with the world for an audience. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. warned that rioting is the language of the unheard. As unrest radiated through Minneapolis and the United States as a whole, one narrative in particular, peddled by right-wing media and Republican politicians, is that the Black Lives Matter movement encompassed or sanctioned rioting with little to no regard for whether that was in fact true. Spoiler alert, it's not true. The truth is that the Black Lives Matter marches were, by and large, peaceful, and where violence did arise, it wasn't sanctioned by Black Lives Matter organizers or reflective of the majority of the movement. Did that stop right-wing media or Republican politicians from continuing with this false narrative? No, of course not. Why not? Because they're not speaking to raise awareness or disseminate truth, but to perpetuate their power among their base. Misleading Republican voters to believe that persons of color are violent or destroying cities is a means to an end for them to maintain loyalty and power. It serves as a powerful distraction from all the ways these Republican politicians screw over working families and community interests like public schools, clean water, air, and food. How do we know these politicians aren't actually concerned about truth or public safety? Because there were riots. There were people inciting violence and trying to destroy cities. And the silence of Republican politicians was and continues to be deafening. Why? Because the violence is largely and systematically at the hands of white supremacists, those extremists who are at the heart of the political activism in their base. I love truth. Even though inconvenient and painful at times, truth is consistent, honest, predictable, and has a way of finding her way to the surface. One group of white supremacists, white nationalists, who are at the heart of violence across the country, are the Proud Boys. If you're wondering why they sound familiar, they're the group that outgoing President Trump told to, quote, stand back and stand by on national television during a presidential debate. As you can imagine, the call to arms was both energizing and empowering for these violent, corrosive extremists. Returning to Minneapolis following George Floyd's murder, turns out it was Ivan Hunter, a white supremacist extremist who self-identifies as a Boogaloo Boy, a group similar to the Proud Boys, who shot 13 rounds from an AK-47 into the Minneapolis Police Department. He would later go on to social media and brag that he set fire to the precinct. Ivan is buddies with Stephen Carrillo, another Boogaloo Boy, who is charged with murdering a federal officer in California. How many remember the videos circulating on social media of a white man dressed in all black with his face concealed who took a hammer to the windows of a local Twin Cities business before walking away? Community members attempted to stop and go after him. Did right-wing media or Republican politicians condemn him or his felonious vandalism of local businesses? No. They continued to mislead people to believe that it was persons of color, or quote-unquote liberals, who were destroying the city, when nothing could be further from the truth. 3 white supremacists have been charged for their terroristic violence in Nevada. White supremacists are responsible for recent violence in Washington, D.C. in furtherance of their protests of Donald Trump's loss in the election. White supremacists in Michigan are now facing charges for running a, quote, hate camp, training young people to prepare for a race war. Some of these extremists even terrorized a husband, wife, and their infant in the middle of the night by showing up on their porch, believing that the house was occupied by someone else. You see, they were targeting a podcaster who had the audacity to be critical of neo-Nazis. 21 white supremacists have been indicted in Utah on federal drug and firearms charges. It's not uncommon for these criminal street gangs to use and deal methamphetamine. Rural Wisconsin is a hotbed for methamphetamine and white supremacy. These examples are just the tip of the iceberg, but you get the point. While the Department of Homeland Security designates white supremacy as the source of the, quote, most persistent and lethal threat to our country, Republican politicians and their voters turn a blind eye. Surely this doesn't hit close to home, right? Not here in Hudson. Sadly, not true. Our local Republican Party is run by an extremist who embraces white supremacy with open arms. In one of their last super spreader events prior to the November election, the cover photo for the event featured a Confederate flag and a Trump F your feelings flag in the center. Of course, the word F-U-C-K was spelled out. The activism wing of the local party calls themselves the Activated Patriots. During the election, they could be seen waving their flags on a local freeway overpass. If you observe long enough, you'd find passersby flashing their WP or white power hand signals out the window. On one weekend in particular, a self-described Boogaloo boy left his Activated Patriot group to harass community members peacefully rallying for Joe Biden. With a gun visibly on his hip and using his body to physically intimidate and shove people aside, he flashed his WP hand gestures as he tried to instigate conflict with anyone willing to engage. As someone who personally witnessed the WP hand gestures, I took my observances to our local community group, the Hudson Word of Mouth, in hopes to raise awareness and that we could all agree that we are or should be better than gestures of white supremacy. I was hoping that regardless of partisan politics, we could take a stand and together say, this is not okay. Well, you can guess how that turned out. The Activated Patriots ended up screenshotting my post, distorting the interpretation of it, and comments contained below actually defended white supremacy hand gestures. So there you have it. If you ask Republican voters around here about racism and white supremacy, many will passionately denounce both privately. They don't self-identify as supporters of either. At the same time, there is zero expectation that local political leadership publicly denounce racism and/or white supremacy, and there is apparently no consequence come election time for the silence that empowers local extremists and more racism in our community. So why the silent enabling of white supremacy by local Republican politicians? Why won't you read about any of what is going on in our local newspaper? Because these ugly, corrosive extremists serve a purpose. They empower Republican politicians. Going back to asking Republican voters if these extremists reflect their values or that which they teach their children, privately they'll say of course not. I guess the question I have is, why is this not then a deal breaker for them? Why are we as a community still voting for politicians who empower and enable white supremacy in our community? Why are we as a community still voting for politicians who use local extremists to get elected and who are too cowardly to publicly stand up to white supremacy? This is or is supposed to be an easy one. If they can't stand up against obvious evils like white supremacy, why would anyone think they have the fortitude or backbone to stand up for us against corporate donors or corporate interests, or to actually serve local families in our community? Spoiler alert, they don't, but no one would ever know it based on the election time lies. Unless and until we are willing to hold our local politicians accountable for their failure to lead on issues like racism and white supremacy, we are opening our doors to more of the same. We cannot in a good faith turn a blind eye and pretend that we aren't playing a part in this. The buck stops with us, the voters. Episode 28 tomorrow. See you there.